Hello and welcome to And the Runner-Up Is. This week on the show, we're talking the 1944 Best Actress race at the Academy Awards, where Ingrid Bergman won for her performance in Gaslight. But why did she beat fellow nominees Claudette Colbert, Bette Davis, Greer Garson, and Barbara Stanwyck? We'll explore all this and more today on And the Runner-Up Is. Hello and welcome back to And the Runner-Up Is. I'm your host, Kevin Jacobson, here to talk about the 17th year of Best Actress at the Oscars, which covered the films of 1944. We'll be discussing why Ingrid Bergman won, why the losers lost, and who we think was the runner-up of this Best Actress race. And my guest today has been heard so many times on this show that I've honestly lost count, but it's actually been a while. The last main show episode he was on was in December of 2020. My former Gold Derby colleague, he's also a filmmaker now. Please welcome back to the show, Zach Laws.
Thank you for having me. I can't believe it's been that long since I was on the main show. Like an entire year has passed.
So much has happened in between then and now.
Yeah. How
are we doing?
I've been asleep for the past 14 months. That's why I haven't been on. So
I wish that were me.
Well, I'm always glad to be back on. Thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. Well, before we talk 1944, let's talk about this category of Best Actress and get your taste here. So my first question for you, Zach, what is your favorite Best Actress win of all time?
There were a lot of different names that I considered for this. But when you first gave me this prompt, there was someone who immediately popped into my mind. And so I thought it has to be her. And that's Frances McDormand in Fargo.
Yay. That's a new answer.
All right.
I like getting new answers.
I'm glad to give you one.
Yes.
Fargo was a movie that I was obsessed with when I was a teenager. I saw it for the first time. I rented it on VHS tape because there wasn't a DVD out yet even of this movie from the library. I had it for 7 days and I watched it every day that I had it. So I watched it twice in one day when I had this.
Wow.
That's how much I loved this movie when I first saw it. And to me, like Roger Ebert made this point in his Great Movies review. I think that without Frances McDormand and the character of Marge Gunderson, Fargo would just be like a really entertaining dark comedy. Yeah. But because of her in that role, that film has a layer of humanity to it that makes it more than just like comedic in cold blood, as Ebert said. So that's why I had to choose her, even though she's like maybe borderline supporting in that film. She is so much like the heart of that movie. And, you know, it's just, like I said, I've seen it so many times I could probably quote it from heart.
That's a great choice. And that's one I'm very much looking forward to eventually covering, especially because there's so much going on in that performance beyond just being, you know, kind of funny, you know, Midwestern kind of kooky accent thing. There's a lot of depth there that I'm excited to dive into.
Yes. I mean, yeah, you put it right on the head. Like there's a level of humanity to her that goes beyond just the kind of like, you know, the you betches of it.
Right.
And that's what a great actress does.
Exactly. Well, my other question on the flip side, what would you say is your most heartbreaking loss in Best Actress?
Well, this might be a little basic, but it's Gloria Swanson in Sunset Boulevard. And I mean, I'll throw in there Bette Davis and All About Eve as well. I mean, Sunset Boulevard's like a top 10 film for me. And much like with McDormand and Fargo, I think like Swanson takes a character that is on the surface a caricature and imbues her with so much humanity And I think that like part of the reason why she lost, and I think this is probably true of Bette Davis as well, who gives her career best performance in All About Eve. I think those performances were just a little too real for,
Too close for comfort.
yeah. And like, no, nothing against Judy Holliday in Born Yesterday, like enjoyable movie, but I think that what Swanson gets at, and Davis as well, what they get at is a much deeper kind of humanity that really appeals to me.
Wow. How rude to Judy Holliday. What is this? Being the Ricardos?
Yeah, right. It's interesting too. It's like we're talking about like our episode today, Sunset Boulevard. That's Billy Wilder.
Yeah.
Bette Davis, Mr. Skeffington, and
Mm-hmm.
Born Yesterday. That's George Cukor. So
Yeah,
just a little tie-in to what we're talking about today.
exactly. Well, I'm very excited to jump right in. Let's talk about this year at the Oscars 17th Academy Awards. The nominees were Ingrid Bergman for Gaslight, Claudette Colbert for Since You Went Away, Bette Davis for Mr. Skeffington, Greer Garson for Mrs. Parkington, and Barbara Stanwyck for Double Indemnity, with the winner being Ingrid Bergman. So, before we break down these nominees on an individual level, what are your overall thoughts on this lineup?
It's interesting watching all of these movies back to back to back. You basically have all women playing wives, right?
Yeah, true.
Um, and they relate to their husbands in different ways, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Sort of indicative, I guess, of like what kind of roles were offered to women in Hollywood at that time. It's really striking to just kind of see like somebody like Barbara Stanwyck competing against Claudette Colbert
Mm-hmm.
in Since You Went Away, right? You just could not get more two polar opposite performances, and in like women, like the way that these women relate to their husbands or to like the men in their lives. It's also very indicative of when you look at the inclusion of people like Bette Davis and Mr. Skeffington and Greer Garson and Mrs. Parkington, two movies that I just like keep getting mixed up in my head. Um, like what kinds of performances the Academy was recognizing at that time, and what kinds of movies they deemed to be important. And then, of course, you have somebody like Ingrid Bergman, I think, who sort of straddles that line in a weird way between those two extremes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we also just have more of the classic 40s rubber stamping going on here.
Yeah.
Each and every one of these nominees is a past nominee or winner.
Mhm.
So sadly, no newcomers to talk about today. But this is also one of those very fascinating lineups to me that I feel like you can really think about in kind of a tier system. Like, I think you have two here that can safely be considered probably also Rands
Mm-hmm.
and probably weren't coming close to winning. And then below Ingrid Bergman, you have two people who I think are very good in their films and are doing very different things. But I think a case can be made maybe for either of them as a plausible runner up. I'm excited to talk about that later.
Yeah.
But on the whole, I'd say I'm pretty positive on this lineup. Even the ones that aren't as stellar, I do think have at least some interesting points that we could talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So let's jump right in, shall we?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Well, going in alphabetical order, we're going to start off with Claudette Colbert for Since You Went Away. Alrighty. So happy to be talking about Claudette Colbert again. Feels like it's been a while. Her previous nomination was for Private Worlds back in 1935. So this is quite a gap. And this would end up being her final nomination. And so, a little background on this film. It was really spearheaded by David O. Selznick, who wanted to make a big production in the vein of Gone with the Wind and Mrs. Miniver, which I think has a very clear influence on this film. And he assembled a whole bunch of movie stars, including Claudette. This is a life on the home front drama that takes place in the present day, which is World War II. So it's about a family with Claudette playing the matriarch, Anne, and her husband goes off to war, and it's up to her to keep things up back at home. and she's friends with this other soldier named Tony, who is about to head off to duty, and they have a bit of a flirty relationship going on, even though it never really crosses the line. And then a big portion of the film is devoted to Anne's daughter, Jane, played by Jennifer Jones, hot off her Oscar win for The Song of Bernadette. And she gets a whole storyline where she happens to like Tony, but then she also has someone else who likes her, Bill, and she ends up bonding with him and getting into a relationship. So that's kind of going on. And then we're back to Claudette Colbert in the end. I would say really anchored by Claudette, though, in general. But what do we think of this performance from Claudette?
First of all, I'd say, like, this movie, I feel like almost collapses under the weight of Selznick's ambitions for it.
Yeah.
Like you said, he wanted to recreate the kind of epic feel of Gone with the Wind. But what I find so interesting about this movie is that it's really a very intimate character drama, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, there's not even these kinds of massive set pieces like you have in Gone with the Wind. It's just like spending a lot of time with this family.
Yeah.
And so, like, even though I think you could have probably shaved a good half hour off of this film, if not more.
I should have mentioned it's almost 3 hours long.
Yeah, with an intermission.
With an intermission.
I do find this movie to be very charming. And I think a big part of that comes from Claudette Colbert's performance. This is the woman who won an Oscar for It Happened One Night, and has been in things like Imitation of Life, the original one, and DeMille's Cleopatra. But like, I always find her to be really at her best in these kinds of modern roles, and I think that her sort of innate likability goes a long way in carrying you through this massive film. It's a very sympathetic performance, I find.
Yeah, I really like Claudette here. She does have a very warm presence. She's very maternal, and that's really what is required of this role. Just like with Greer Garson and Mrs. Miniver, the idea that you're comfortable with her,
mm-hmm.
like you feel like you're in safe hands, and she has a very comforting presence. So for that part of it, no notes. She nails it. Mm-hmm. But then she also has to deal with her husband being away, which we see her really trying to cope with it in the very first scene of the film. And she's just come back from seeing him off to war, and she's just silently walking through her house and realizing that she has a pretty long and painful road
mm-hmm.
ahead of her. And we do also get some narration here for exposition, really. But you really also are seeing the pain, I think, in her face. And I think that whole first scene is very well done in terms of just immediately grabbing your sympathy for this character.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, there's a huge chunk in the middle where we check in on her here and there, but it feels like not enough until the last few scenes at the end. But I do think that literally just this one first scene does enough to really establish a connection with the audience.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I mentioned that all 5 of these women are playing wives. Claudette Colbert is the most devoted wife, and the most loyal wife, and you never even see her husband on the screen.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And you're right. I mean, she does do a really good job of just letting you understand how she feels for her husband, even though you don't get to see that relationship on screen, right? You have to like infer a lot from her facial expressions and her body movement, and also like the dialogue that she's given, her voiceover. And I'd also say like the way that she relates to other people. I mean, you mentioned the Joseph Cotton character, Joseph Cotton, who's really good in this movie, and also good in Gaslight.
Having a good year.
Yeah. Like their scenes together are really good and hint at the way that she relates to her husband, because there is like a real chemistry there between the two of them that's never acted upon. And like she still at the same time is treating him almost like a surrogate husband, like kind of getting that kind of affection that she needs while he's away.
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of the film, she gets plenty of material, but it also, some of it feels like the kind of thing we see in a lot of other films about suffering wives and suffering mothers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I will just add, I do enjoy her sort of exasperation that she shows sometimes,
Yeah.
like when Shirley Temple, who's also in this film, who plays her younger daughter, she's just like pestering her about taking on a boarder,
Yeah.
and she ultimately is just like, fine, like just relents to her.
Yeah. That's a
I
really
mean,
good early
yeah,
scene. Yeah.
yeah. Like, I think she still has that sort of glamorous, soft glow look to her that a lot of movie stars would have at this time, but
Mm-hmm.
you definitely see some of the weariness, I think, of being a mother of two very eager teenage girls who
Mm-hmm.
can kind of be exhausting at times.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the material isn't really giving her a whole lot to do and on that end, other than, as you were saying, the parts with Joseph Cotton, which I do find to be a kind of fascinating dynamic to just watch play out, because he's not exactly making advancements, but he's sort of playfully teasing her about wanting to get with her and how she's like the ultimate woman for him.
Mm-hmm.
And she's kind of like laughing it off. And actually, I think what we get here is some of the classic dynamic that we had in It Happened One Night, where she's reacting to all the sort of nonsense that's coming her way from Clark Gable. I mean, with that dynamic, it's like one of the best on-screen pairings in the history of cinema. So
Yeah.
I don't know if this one quite measures up, but this is the dynamic that I think does play to her strengths, to have the kind of sparring partner.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny. I was just the other day, I was watching scenes from It Happened One Night because it was on TCM. And, you're right. Like, she's so good, like, working with a partner. I think of also like her and Joel McCrea in the Palm Beach Story, just like the way that she's able to act as a sparring partner for these men and hold her own against them. And like, we should say, like, there was no way that the production code at the time was going to have her have an affair with Joseph Cotton's character,
Of course, yeah.
But it is like, I think it's a credit to her as a performer that she's able to hint at the possibility of that without ever actually like explicitly putting it into words.
Yeah. That's a credit also to the film itself for sort of towing the line there. And this is a good example of working within the confines of the Hays Code.
Right. Which a lot of these movies that we're going to be talking about had to do.
Oh yeah. Pretty much all of them. Yeah. But, there's the whole section with Jennifer Jones and all of her boy troubles. And I have to say, like, just as a little tangent here, if you know the behind the scenes of what was happening at this time, which I do now on this watch that I didn't know before, I would say it plays quite differently. Because Jennifer Jones was married to Robert Walker, who plays Bill, but they were basically on the brink of separating, which is in part because Jennifer Jones was in an affair with David O. Selznick. So I definitely felt for Robert Walker doing this film, but yeah, I don't know. Did I'm sure you probably know this story too, but does that sort of like make this feel kind of icky to you?
I definitely it definitely made me feel bad for Robert Walker, because you kind of, you wonder how much of that was just like method acting, right?
Yeah.
And those scenes that he has with Jennifer Jones. And I think it also it kind of, because I think Jennifer Jones holds the record for the longest performance by somebody who is nominated in the supporting category. I think she's got about an hour and 15 minutes of screen time in this nearly 3-hour film. So it's definitely I think you could make a case that she's sort of a co-lead, if not
I think
outright
she is
protagonist.
A co-lead.
It definitely feels like Selznick was giving her a very plum role, because of what was going on between the two of them.
Yeah. But anyway, this whole middle section with Jennifer reminded me of the scene in I, Tonya where Allison Janney is like, well, my storyline's disappearing.
Yeah, it's which I wonder if that's how Claudette Colbert felt when she was like,
Yeah, exactly.
you know,
Like, what happened to? I thought I was the lead of this movie. Now we're off with Jennifer Jones, and I'm not even on screen for like
yeah.
half an hour. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think like, we're talking about the sort of lumbering weight of this movie, and I do think that like that sort of portion of the movie does put a bit of a drag on this a bit.
Yeah, I
So,
would
but
say so.
I think that's sort of like due to Selznick's, who was also the screenwriter of this
Mm-hmm.
film, credited screenplay by the producer, which is pretty ballsy
Yeah.
way to credit yourself. His ambitions to turn this into something more akin to his epic films.
Right.
It's interesting, not just like a side tangent, like a movie I kept thinking about watching this was The Best Years of Our Lives,
Yeah.
which I think is like a vastly superior film in every way.
Very much so. Yeah.
Yeah, which again is like 3 hours long, just sort of a domestic drama. But I think like really does a much better job of like balancing out between those three protagonists and also not making you feel as though the length is being padded. It really does, like you appreciate the extra length in that film, I think.
Yeah. The Best Years of Our Lives is what David O. Selznick thought he was doing here.
Yeah, exactly.
But for Claudette, I think the moment that comes before the intermission,
Mm-hmm.
where she's crying over the scrapbook of just their life together, her and her husband, and she's just wishing for her husband to come back, and is like, the dog has come up and she's like weeping into the dog.
Yeah.
I think is another quiet but very well done moment that could really be very melodramatic. But I think it's that kind of, that very silent sort of quiet devastation feeling that it did sort of get to me.
Yeah, I mean, it got to me too, and I think, like you said, there's a lot of opportunity there for her to overplay it, and I think like there's some credit should go to the credited director of this movie, John Cromwell, for not overemphasizing those emotions, like just
Right.
allowing them to play out as naturally and subtly as possible.
Yeah, very effective. She has a lot of interesting quiet moments, even in these more melodramatic types of scenes throughout the rest of the film, like when she's comforting her daughter when something's happened to Bill, and her daughter is just devastated and she's weeping, and she just sort of tells her to cry your heart out.
Yeah.
And I love just the line, I don't remember exactly what it is, but it's talking about how like a wonderful boy loved you, and that doesn't just happen to everybody, something along those lines. Again, it's just such a comforting presence and so locked into that scene too, and she doesn't overshadow Jennifer Jones, but she does, I think, manage to sort of outact her quite a bit in this film, if I'm being honest, just because of how she modulates a scene. Like, a lot of the stuff with Jennifer Jones is like very direct surface level stuff that she's doing, to be honest, whereas with Claudette I feel like I'm seeing a real person who's lived a life.
That's probably why Selznick didn't put them in that many scenes together, because he knew she could outact her.
Yeah. So. Yeah. But let's just also talk about this ending, which I think is Claudette's strongest moment. She definitely ends the movie very strong, which is, it's set at Christmas time, and she has a kind of a bittersweet parting with Tony, and it's to the point where everybody's left, and Hattie McDaniel's there. Hattie McDaniel is also in this movie.
Yeah.
And she plays their maid. And she reveals that she's been holding on to these Christmas presents for months that were picked out by her husband for the family. And it's another really great scene of her just reacting, and we see her just on the brink of tears, and then she's opening up the present, and it's this powder box, and he says that like he sent his eternal love with it, and she breaks down. And I think that's another heartbreaking moment that she just really nails, and that's another very, even more so, a very easy scene to make like very corny.
Yeah.
Quite honestly, but she sells it because you're seeing this woman who I think is typically just sort of keeping her composure, finally releasing all of this pain that she's kept inside of her.
Yeah, because I mean, the important thing to note also is that, like, her husband has been missing in action, so she doesn't know whether or not he's
Right.
alive or dead. And like, there's this. I think when you lose somebody who's close to you, a lot of importance kind of gets put on things that they left behind, even just like tiny objects like that. And I think that she does a really good job of imbuing that music box with all of the emotions that she has for her husband, who she doesn't know whether or not he's still alive or not, and as far as she knows, is gone forever. So I agree. That's a really good and effective scene, piece of acting from her.
Yeah. And then that transitions into the phone call where it's revealed that he is alive. I mean, the film really sends you out on a high, and
Yeah.
especially for her performance, that even with that middle portion, I was like, she's good, but I'm not really seeing like where the nomination comes from.
Mhm.
I think it's this ending few scenes where it's like, this is where she secures the nomination and proves that why she was a top star for so long.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I mean, even when Selznick lays it on thick with the music choice and the postscript at the end, she's still she's very touching, and that got to me. Like, this effective melodrama, it really does work in large part because of how Colbert plays a lot of those scenes.
Yeah, it's definitely very earnest and sentimental feeling, but I don't think anything that is like that mawkish about it is due to Claudette.
Yeah, I agree.
So that's a credit to her that she really grounds it and doesn't make it sort of become this weepy, cheesy sort of feeling. So
yeah,
good on you, Claudette. Let's just read a quick review from the time period from the New York Times. Pretty simple, but they said Claudette Colbert gives an excellent show of gallantly self-controlled emotion.
That's I like that, gallantly self-controlled line there.
Yeah. So
was that Bosley Crowther?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, that sounds
resident critic of New York Times at this time.
That sounded like a Crowther.
Yeah. So yeah, I think there was just a lot of good respect for this very valiant kind of role. I think it's an easy role to kind of get behind.
Yeah, I'd say so. And I mean, like, in terms of like her getting the nomination, it's 8 years since she had been nominated.
Yeah.
I think that Oscar voters are probably happy to find an excuse to nominate her again.
Right. In a big film like this.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Anything else on Claudette before we move on?
No, I think we're good.
Okay. Well, I'll just say as a final mention of Claudette that I've enjoyed all three of her performances, even Private Worlds. I think she's the best part of all three of her films, and I'm glad that she was nominated for them. I wish she was nominated for more so I could talk about her more.
Yeah, I mean, I would have thrown her a nomination for The Palm Beach Story. She's wonderful in that movie. So.
Yeah, but we love you, Claudette. All right, let's move on to a big one. We're back. Bette Davis for Mr. Skeffington. Okay, well, yes. Hold on to your butts. Okay. So we took 1 week off after a 5-year streak, and here she is back again with her 7th official nomination, 8th if you count the unofficial write-in for Of Human Bondage. Either way, she is now the most nominated actress up to this point. Obviously, that would be broken by Meryl and others later on, but at this point, Bette is the queen of the Oscars, essentially. So, Mr. Skeffington, it was based on a novel. Apparently, she had been offered this role a few years before this, but turned it down because she didn't think that she could convincingly play an older woman. Eventually the script was sort of reworked, and a lot of different actresses like Irene Dunne and Greta Garbo were sought out for it, but they just turned it down too. And here's Bette ending up in the part anyway. And there was a lot of turmoil, from what I understand, behind the scenes Her husband had died a week into pre-production,
Yes.
and this really set her on edge. And really, through the most of the production, she had a lot of arguments with the director. She was lashing out at co-stars. Sounds like a pretty miserable time from everything I've read. But let's talk about the film itself.
Yeah.
So Bette Davis, she's playing Fanny, who is a very vain and spoiled woman, much like she's played in the past. Her brother is in trouble for embezzling money from his boss, Mr. Skeffington, played by the great Claude Rains. And she tries to get her brother out of trouble by getting into a relationship with Mr. Skeffington and then ultimately marrying him. And eventually the brother dies in the war. This is pretty early on, so it's not that much of a spoiler, but
For this
it's
movie
also
that
off
was
screen
like
anyway.
80 years ago.
Right. But, I'm saying not a lot of people have probably seen this.
Sure, yeah.
But so when that happens, Fanny really feels like she has no reason to be in this relationship, and it's a loveless marriage, and so they get divorced. They also have a daughter, but she doesn't really want to raise her, so she sends her off to be with her ex-husband. And eventually she gets older and has to really just face her own mortality, and it's a mess. Big sweeping melodrama. It's almost 2.5 hours long, another long one here. So actually, Zach, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Bette Davis, the icon, and then also what you think of her in this film.
Well, I mean, Bette Davis is, I think I was professing my love for her performance in All About Eve just earlier. She's an all-time favorite actress for me.
Yeah.
I think, you look at like a lot of those movies that she was nominated for, especially the ones that she did with her sort of semi-lover, William Wyler, especially things like The Letter and The Little Foxes, and also Jezebel, which she won one of her 2 Oscars for. She has a certain kind of, there's a real contemporary quality to her that I think sets her apart from other actresses of the time. There's a reason why she's an icon, and she remains an icon to this day, even in movies like this where Mr. Skeffington, that I'm a little more mixed on. I find her fascinating to watch, to say the least. So, yeah, I mean, count me amongst those Oscar fanboys who appreciate Bette Davis.
Yes, groundbreaking.
It's like,
hot take.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, I love Bette Davis. I'm gonna join the club there, but yeah, I feel like I'm always compelled by whatever it is that she's doing, this included. But this is definitely not my favorite.
No, to say the least.
Yeah, she is making some very strong choices here.
The whole movie is making some very strong choices. I think, it's one of those movies that I realized I had never seen before until I recorded this podcast. I felt like I'd seen it, just because of Oscar watching and, bits and pieces on TCM. But I never actually sat down and watched the entire 2.5 hour movie all the way through. And within the first few minutes before she shows up, I was like, is this movie actually bad? I don't. And it becomes more inexplicable as it goes on, which is, I think, I was fascinated by it, and certainly fascinated by the choices she was making. But I don't, I feel like the movie doesn't have a firm grasp on what it wants to say about this character. And that kind of leads Davis to sort of, act out in a lot of really strange ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, it starts with the voice, which is playing it very much like a Mary Pickford coquette type of thing.
Yeah.
Which, if people have seen that film, you know what I'm talking about. And it felt very forced to me in the beginning. And I was surprised that she was able to sort of keep that up for the full 2.5 hours here.
Yeah.
To be honest, I think she kind of overplays this role, and it verges into camp territory at times.
Yes.
And that's not something that I've said about any of her other performances up to this point, even the ones that are her just being like, head bitch in charge, Bette Davis. Like, she still has some nuance in those other performances that really showed why she has been this enduring icon for so long. Whereas this is just like loud and garish, and it's cranked up to 11
Yeah.
in a way that I felt like I lost the humanity underneath everything.
Well, and I think again, like I think you have to blame the way that this movie is directed for that. I mean, this movie is directed by Vincent Sherman, who I watched on the DVD that I got of this. There was this little like 8-minute featurette on the making of the movie. Vincent Sherman was still alive for that. He was like 99 years old or something like that. Not a director who I was very familiar with. And as I looked at his credits, in addition to this, it was a lot of kind of like, melodramas and what they would call at the time a woman's picture, because it had a woman at the center of it. But like everything in this movie is cranked up to 11. Like it has this really awful score by Franz Waxman. There's a lot of great scores in the past. But this is not one of them. The only person who's kind of like subtle in this movie is Claude Rains.
Absolutely.
And like everybody else is just like playing it up in almost this cartoonish way. And the music is like emphasizing all of that. And I think that like Davis, is, I suppose she was like being made to do. I have no idea. I don't know if it was like partly what the director was telling her to do or just like her take on this character. But, whatever it is, it's definitely, it feels like somebody doing a Bette Davis impersonation more than Bette Davis playing a character.
Right. I would completely agree with that. I mean, just from reading, because I checked out a book about Bette Davis out from the library, there's a whole interesting chapter about this whole production of this film that is really delving into how Bette Davis so controlled everything that she was doing on the film that even the director felt like he couldn't say anything otherwise.
Yeah. They sort of alluded to that in this little featurette. Was just like, she liked Vincent Sherman because he would leave her alone. So,
exactly.
He might have felt forced to leave her alone for all we know.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, like, and also just, this film is written by Julius J. and Philip G. Epstein, the people who wrote Casablanca. What I found to be really strange about this film was that it doesn't have a coherent idea about who this character is, because throughout this, like I've watched this making of, and they keep talking about how she's this very vain, self-centered woman, and like every decision she makes is based on that, sort of neglecting the fact that the entire first act of the movie is about her getting into a relationship with this guy in order to save her brother. And, when he dies in the film and she realizes she's trapped in this loveless marriage, I thought, okay, that's kind of an interesting, like, I'm not into this movie really because of how it's, how over the top and melodramatic it is, but there's at least some kind of an interesting notion there.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it turns into this thing where like she loses her beauty after a bout with diphtheria, and she has this horrendous old age man.
Yeah, it's really bad.
Which apparently, like, that was a thing that the director feuded with her about. There was like, I think this is too much, and she said, "Oh no, my audience wants to see me like this." I think it was a little bit of vanity.
I read that too.
A little bit of vanity on her part,
Yeah. Yep.
And like this is where the movie starts to, become fascinating to me, and I was just like, this is not very good, but I am fascinated to see where it goes next, because like she's trying to like land a husband, to prove she still can, and everyone's commenting on how ugly she is. Then I guess not to jump ahead and spoil the ending, but like it sets up this whole thing about how she needs to find her inner beauty, and she finds that inner beauty by, her ex-husband, Claude Rains, coming back from a time spent in a concentration camp.
Yeah.
Really brutal twist for his character. He accepts her back, but it turns out that he's blind and can't see her. So it just kind of steps on its own message about how, like, inner beauty is what will make you beautiful on the outside. Like, okay, well, the guy can't see what you look like anyway, so
what are we even saying?
Yeah. And they're just kind of, her cousin, George, I think is his name, he's just like,
yeah,
he'll always remember her as beautiful because he can't see her now. Like,
God.
It's really almost like appalling to call this a women's picture because of the message that it has about women.
I walked away from this movie being like, does this film hate women?
Yeah, I just...
Yeah, because if I'm a woman walking out of this film in 1944, I'm like, that made me feel actively bad.
Yeah. Well, and I think, like, it's... not to keep harping on that, I think it's indicative of what, a lot of films at that time, what the role of women was, because it's like this film and another one we'll talk about is just like, how do the men in this movie view this woman, right?
Yeah. And I gotta say that, like, this discussion right here is very indicative of when I look back at even the first few Academy Awards that I was talking about. There were quite a few performances there pre-code, specifically pre-code, that were not about that being defined by the relationship of a man in your life. There was a lot of very interesting characters of, like, mothers and murderers and very just, like, fascinating characters, prostitutes in protagonist roles. And then we have what we have here, which is a lot of the same kind of dynamic about, and it's all very controlled by and written by men.
Yeah.
Without a lot of women input. So
yeah. And, like, Bette Davis is somebody who has played those kinds of interesting roles in the past, and she would in the future as well. I think that's why this feels so out of character to her, because even, like, things like, you see the amount of control she takes in films like The Letter or The Little Foxes, or even, like, now Voyager, where she's, ostensibly supposed to be playing, like, an ugly duckling, right? Like, she's not defined by those characteristics.
Right, exactly. I mean, as far as this movie, I personally prefer the first half of the film more, because it feels like what she's doing is, maybe I'm just projecting, but it feels like what she's doing is very pointed and intentional in kind of satirizing this type of selfish, vain woman who is putting on airs, and, like, we in the audience can see how blatantly she is manipulating people in certain situations to get what she wants, especially everything to do with trying to court Mr. Skeffington and sort of batting her eyelashes and pretending to be interested in him and, like, talking about the stock exchange.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's always fun to watch her in that kind of manipulative mode, and I feel like I understood who this character was, like, she's a society woman who loves being the center of attention, and she intentionally acts a certain way because she knows it'll get her what she wants, and she knows that it's what's expected of her. I mean, sometimes the line readings are a little forced, and I don't know how much it's the character or the actress in certain cases. Like, when she's in the office at work, like, at his work, I should say, some of her lines felt a little off. But then there are other scenes where I do think she's quite good, like when she does hear about her brother's death, and the way she makes that scene sort of escalate, I think, is quite effective. And kind of brutal with the way she's so cold with the divorce and everything that happens there and with their child. And then where the film really does start to lose me is that last half, or I guess wherever it is that we're flashing forward to the point where her daughter's now older and she's herself is getting older. I just, first of all, on a just surface level, I don't accept the idea that she would have the exact same, like, high-pitched voice, that she would still have that layer of, like, artifice to her even.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I get that people don't change that drastically even over that period of time, but it It doesn't feel like there's been any change at all with her other than getting older and developing some wrinkles. Like there's barely a hint that at the end of the film that she'll have some redemption and act in a less selfish manner. And when we do get that redemption, it feels unearned to me. Like it's not a choice that character would make based on the movie that I was watching.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's not even that she gets older. It's like she has a bout with diphtheria, and then that just
yes.
turns her into, an 80-year-old woman.
Yeah.
Overnight. It's just like, I mean, I should say when I say that the second half of this movie fascinated me, it wasn't that it fascinated me in a good way. It was just like I was like perplexed that was what this movie turned into from what it was in the beginning. Where
right.
I mean, the first half of this movie is, I think, a much more traditional kind of like Warner Brothers period melodrama of the time.
Yeah.
The second half is just kind of one inexplicable scene after another as it tries to, like the moment where I just kind of like truly thought this turned into a camp classic almost was there's a scene she goes to visit a psychiatrist played by George Coulouris, who is Mr. Thatcher from Citizen Kane. And he's like, the advice that he gives her is just like, you need to get your husband back because, you are an ugly old woman. And
yeah,
I thought like, what is that? And like the way that Davis plays that scene where she's just like lying about her age to him. She says, oh, I'm 45. He says, no, you're more like 50. Like and he opens up the window because her perfume is too strong and all this stuff. It's just, I was like, what is happening in this film? Is this honestly what this is about?
Yeah.
Like I couldn't believe it. So, yeah, I mean, I would say that it's like a better movie in the second half. It's just more that like I just did not expect it to go that way.
Yeah. I will say like the second half will probably stick in my mind more than in just thinking back on this film, like what happened there.
Yeah.
Like the whole scene where she's looking around this big empty house she has now, and she has all the mirrors around her, and she's like looking at all of them in horror.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. I don't know. Maybe this is the greatest movie ever made because of just how much it is. It is truly on one, and
yes,
I don't.
I feel like this is a movie that should be studied more.
Yeah,
just to understand what is happening.
Yeah, I mean,
and why are these choices being made? And what are we even trying to say about this in the end?
Yeah, I truly don't know.
Yeah.
I will say, I mean, like, Claude Rains was also nominated for this movie, and he is quietly affecting in a couple of scenes, and I really do think that like there was the missed potential for this film to be more effective if it had been like, because there is something to the idea of like somebody realizing that they are trapped in a loveless marriage, and the effect that has on you. But this film just seems to be more interested in like playing up this kind of, I don't even know how to describe it. It's this more melodramatic idea about like losing your outer beauty and what that does to you. And yeah.
It sort of feels like we're commenting on it and saying like we have to value inner beauty and all of that, which is a nice message, but then it's also sort of indulging in making this kind of like grotesque outer beauty, like really indulging in her wrinkles and just like looking at her appearance, and it feels like a mixed message.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah. One last thing that really bugs me. Why isn't this just called Mrs. Skeffington?
Yeah.
Is that the elephant in the room here?
Because
like,
when he disappears for a while, I was just like, why is this still about him? Like...
Right. Genuinely don't understand.
I don't understand this movie.
Yeah.
Really don't.
So many inexplicable choices.
Yeah.
But maybe you're right. Maybe it's a secret masterpiece that I have to watch again and again to fully understand.
I wonder if it's not like because I could see like drag queens doing Mrs. Skeffington as a character.
Totally.
Like it should have a revival in
It should.
in that way.
Yeah.
But
So hopefully we'll see the effect of
yeah.
this after this episode, and everyone will check it out and they'll be like, wow, this is a secret
Yeah.
masterpiece. These guys are wrong. This is from, again, the New York Times.
Mhm.
They said, Miss Davis's performance is impressive. You have to give it that. She plays a siren with all the stops out and in 30 years of styles of women's clothes. Unfortunately, the style of her lady doesn't change perceptibly, particularly the voice, which is probably the most monotonously affected one you'll ever hear.
Yeah, I mean, I think impressive is one way to put it. So, like,
Yes.
I think
You certainly leave with an impression of a performance.
she would do this much better in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane.
That's exactly what I was thinking too.
Yeah.
Like, she would master this 20 years later.
Exactly.
But if you want to see a lesser version of Baby Jane, here we are.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I think we're done on that one, wouldn't you say?
I would say yes.
All right. Well, let's move on to Greer Garson in Mrs. Parkington. This is the 4th episode in a row that I'm talking about Greer Garson. She's still on her big streak of being nominated 5 years in a row, and she's still plugging along, and this is another role of hers where she's playing a kind of noble woman, but this one is of a slightly different variety, I would say, that allows her to show a little more emotion, so that's good. But Mrs. Parkington was actually chosen for Greer, and I do say that intentionally in the sense that she felt like, you know, this was just another good girl patrician role for her, and she was getting tired of it. But the story, she plays Susie Parkington, who we first meet as a 80-year-old woman who is dealing with her relatives, and the film has a structure to it where we're going back and forth between her in the present and then her having flashbacks to meeting her husband, Mr. Parkington, and making friends with this French woman, this society woman played by Agnes Moorehead, who's showing her the ways of the world and how to be a society woman like her. And she's dealing with her husband and his kind of shady business dealings. And the film, in the end, is sort of about the idea of being a good person and earning your wealth and your livelihood and all that lovely stuff. So let's talk Greer. I've mentioned before, I've been pretty hot and cold on Miss Greer Garson in the past. I'm curious your take on her, if you have a take on her, and what your thoughts are on this performance.
Yeah, I mean, Greer Garson, I mean, I'll say this. It's like I've never had a strong feeling about her either way. I, for many years, would get her confused with Deborah Kerr, who who I like much more as an actress. Yeah. Garson, I think, like I've never disliked her in a movie. I think it's more just like she never was somebody who really grabbed me, her screen persona. I think like this is actually, because of course I've seen Mrs. Miniver, and I like Mrs. Miniver perfectly fine, and I like her in Random Harvest as well. But aside from that, I've never really been taken with her. Although there are moments in this film where I think she kind of gets to do a little bit more with her screen persona than she's been able to previously. This will sound kind of piggish of me, but I mean this in a good way.
God.
I don't think that she was ever really allowed to be romantic and beautiful and sensual in a movie. And I think that this one kind of lets her do that in some scenes,
Yeah, okay.
And I was kind of surprised. I was like, oh, wow, I never really, because so much of her screen persona has just been kind of like prim and proper and, kind of like important woman of the day, which, means to completely desexualize her. And I think that this sort of hinted at a different kind of screen persona that she could have had, And so, yeah, I was a little more interested in her in this one than I had been in some of her other Oscar-nominated roles.
Well, this might surprise some people because I've been quite negative on Greer and her nominations, but I thought that this was pretty good.
Yeah.
Not gonna lie. I don't think she's necessarily great, but this felt like it actually played to her strengths, but also that was allowed to have some new shadings to this very noble archetype thing that she crafted for herself. Um, I mean, first of all, she had a very wonky accent work in Blossoms in the Dust, and Madame Curie really not convincingly playing American people. But I found her to actually be believable as an American woman here, which is like a baseline praise, but we're improving. I like that. Do I find her fully convincing as this poor teenage girl that we see in the beginning with the flashbacks? Probably not, but she definitely excels in the portions of the film where she's sort of evolved to a higher class status and is bouncing off of Walter Pidgeon and Agnes Moorehead and actually showing some real personality and, you know, a little bit of sass and a little bit of an edge to her that I was like, okay, Greer, I see you.
Yeah.
Like, I see some personality. I will say the film itself is a little strange in the sense that, like, things are just sort of happening and it rushes through certain moments that I feel like are significant and then sort of slows down at other moments that aren't really as interesting. Like, her mother fully dies at the beginning of the film.
Yeah.
And she barely has time to process that before she's just like whisked away by Mr. Parkington. And she doesn't even really talk about it that much from what I remember after that. So, I mean, it's a strangely written film, I would say. But she's pretty decent, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm more mixed on the film than I am on her performance, which I think, like you said, is kind of oddly structured. I mean, it cuts back and forth between her as a younger woman and her as an 80-year-old, and there's this weird subplot where one of her grandchildren, played by Edward Arnold, who was a full almost 15 years younger than, 15 years older than Greer Garson in real life, and looks it. It's just bizarre hearing him call her Granny. But he gets like caught up in this this like embezzling scheme or something like that, and she's got to decide whether or not she's going to, give all of her money to keep him out of jail. And just like, what does this have to do with the the central plot of this movie? Is there a central plot of this movie? I don't know if there actually is.
I really think so.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's just life. Things are happening.
Yeah, because honestly, we should say this was, the third film in a row that she had starred in opposite Walter Pidgeon?
Yep.
Who, they were America's favorite couple at that time. They were sort of like the, what Bradley Cooper and Jennifer Lawrence were for a little while there.
I guess so, yeah.
Their time. It feels like this movie was just conceived of as an excuse to put them in another movie together, right? Insofar as I can tell, because there's not really much of a plot there. They do have they do have a good screen dynamic together. I was more fascinated in the scenes between her and Agnes Moorehead, who is fully on one in this movie.
Yes. I love Agnes Moorehead in everything.
Yeah.
And she's fantastic here. She gets a nomination in supporting, which, honestly, I think she should have won. I'm just going to throw that out there.
Yeah.
Not a supporting actress podcast, but,
I wish it was so we could talk about her some more, because, she is just
She's great.
Yeah.
Well, let's just talk about it then. That's also my favorite part, is that dynamic. And honestly, I feel like I've discovered that there's something about Greer Garson where, not unlike what my friend Murtada El Fadl says about his favorite actress, Cate Blanchett, I feel like her best scenes are opposite other women.
Yeah.
I feel that way here about her and Agnes Moorehead. I felt that way about Greer with I was almost going to say Jennifer Jones, Teresa Wright
Yeah.
in Mrs. Miniver. I get those mixed up sometimes. And like, even to extend this Cate Blanchett metaphor, I was feeling some Carol vibes. I'm just going to throw it out there.
I was going to ask, I mean, because I got the sense there was like a little bit of queer coding in that relationship, because there is this, there is this sort of sense of like this relationship with this woman opens her up in a way. Like I think about that scene where she takes her shopping for dresses, and you see her, she becomes kind of like glammed up, and shows off a little bit more of her body, as much as they could show off at that time.
Right.
And that was what I meant when I said, like, oh wow, Greer Garson is, like, I've never really seen her like this before, where she kind of is like very sensual and romantic. And I think that dynamic comes out through her relationship with the Agnes Moorehead character.
Yeah. I was really feeling like, Greer is the Therese and Agnes Moorehead is like this more worldly Carol type who's like bringing her out of her shell.
Yeah.
And I mean, keep in mind, like, I know that there are people who think that Greer and Walter Pidgeon are great together and one of the best screen pairings. I get it. Personally, it doesn't quite do it for me, but I respect that opinion. But when I see her with Agnes Moorehead, it's just the way they bounce off each other. The way the two of them just are showing such a genuine affection for each other. I just find it to be the most exciting element of the film. I mean, this is a film from 1944, so of course it's not like they're actually going to explore anything beyond this, but at the very least, I really did buy the two of them as these close friends who are going to maybe even say that they feel like they're more than friends, like they're sisters, because they feel like they're on the same wavelength, which I like.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll say, like, I've never been ignited by the pairing of Garson and Walter Pidgeon, but I think that, like you said, obviously this in a 1944 movie, they're not going to explore that in depth, but I do get the sense that was there in the conception of this film. I might be reading too much into it, but like anybody who's read and seen The Celluloid Closet knows that hints of those kinds of things were often dropped into Hollywood movies at the time in very subtle ways, in order to not raise suspicion from the production code. But I think that there is something to that, and they're just sort of jumping ahead to the ending, when they say goodbye to each other, because Moorehead is going to. So first off, Agnes Moorehead is playing a French woman in this movie.
Yeah.
Don't know if I mentioned that, but like, she's fully got this accent that is just incredible. So she's going to move back to France and leave Garson with her husband. I felt more of a pang from that than I did from when it's revealed that her husband had died, right?
Yeah,
like,
totally.
I honestly, I mean, you mentioned Carol, and which is obviously one of my favorite movies and one of yours as well. I would have liked to have seen a sort of reimagining of this movie from a person like Todd Haynes.
That would be amazing.
Yeah,
Oh my god.
Because I think those elements are definitely there.
Absolutely. But speaking just to her scenes with Walter Pidgeon, I think she does show some passion here at times, and it's very clear to me watching them that they do have a kind of shorthand with each other. I really like the argument scene that they have where he wants to do some sort of shady business deal thing, and she tells him that, she wanted to be his wife, but that she doesn't need him. That there's plenty, or it's the other way around, like, he doesn't need her, that there's plenty of other women who could take her place. I mean, the two of them have like a kind of complicated relationship where she does have a love for him, but she's also kind of appalled by a lot of his behavior a lot of the time. And I think she does a pretty good job there of, towing the line between love and hate that she has for this man. I also love the point where she just casually is revealing that she's been funding her husband's rival, who he intends to put out of business. I don't know. It's just nice to see her getting to show some actual personality and like an attitude after so many films that she was nominated for where she's playing such a saintly woman. And I also, it doesn't go unnoticed to me here that we're talking so much about her dynamic with screen partners, because I look back on those other nominations I've talked about with her, and it feels like she's just on her own island, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are moments where I was watching this movie and I thought, do they actually have a good marriage? Um, you know, because they seem to be at odds with each other a lot. And, later on in the film, he goes off to Europe and seems to be having an open affair with another woman. Which I guess she might have been, Greer Garson might have been having an open affair with another woman too. So, like,
deleted scenes.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I mean, I do. Yeah, I think that again, like so often, her screen persona can be just kind of very matriarchal and just like the ideal of what I think Hollywood would have wanted women to be at the time, very like devoted housewife and devoted mother and stiff upper lip kind of thing. And it is nice to see some new shades here. It makes me wish that she could have explored that a bit more in her filmography, because I think she might have been capable of it.
Yeah, that's the thing with reading about her too, is that it's not like she was actively like being lazy with these choices. Mm-hmm. Like she's only doing these things because this is what she's good at. Like she wanted to branch out. She knew what the perception would be if she would just if she kept doing this same kind of role. Mm-hmm. Like she was definitely actively thinking about her career, but unfortunately the confines of this studio system were really just so limiting for her.
Yeah.
Still giving her incredible roles, like leading roles and like top billing and things like that. So it's not like we have to feel too bad about Greer Garson, but like you do wish that she could have shown other sides of her.
Well, yeah, I mean, her place in history suffers because, I mean, we talked about Bette Davis earlier, and like, Davis's screen persona for the most part gave her a legacy, right? And Garson just kind of feels like one of those people who is like of the time because of that.
Right. She hasn't transcended.
Yeah.
Right. But I do want to talk about her present day scenes too, where she's playing this 80-something-year-old woman, because that's always something that can be very tricky, especially when it comes to makeup and voice, as we were literally just talking about with Bette Davis.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if you'll agree with this. I think she pulls it off pretty well.
Well, I think the makeup in this instance benefits her more because it's a bit more subtle than the one for Davis.
Not as garish.
Yeah. I mean, there were actually parts of this movie when she was playing the old woman where I kind of was, I didn't know if it actually was her or not.
Right. That's how I felt even at the beginning. I was like, oh, that's Greer.
Yeah. So I think that is a compliment to her performance in that.
Right. It's not just the makeup that's telling us that she's an old woman too. Like there's a whole sensibility that she has. Like I feel like she moves a little slower and she's more deliberate, but also is showing someone who is very wise to the world now. And she's definitely been made tough by everything she's been through. And she has this kind of weathered voice, maybe a little overdone, but I found her pretty convincing. On the whole, I was surprised.
I would agree. Yeah, I think she is good in those moments. So
yeah, and especially as like this woman who's doling out advice to her children and her grandchildren. I mean, she, like we've been saying, she has this very patrician sort of sensibility, and it's definitely in full force here as this older woman authority figure type. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, I mean,
I like that.
Yeah, I buy it.
Yeah. One other thing I wanted to point out here, I don't know if you also took note of this, but there's a moment in this film where she's with her husband and they're at their new house and she points to the light and she says, "Is that Gaslight?"
I did, yeah.
And he's like, "It was Gaslight."
Yeah.
And I felt like Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the screen.
I did. Yeah.
Except for another movie that's also in this lineup.
No, I watched this last night and I thought, man, there's a running theme in this This
Yes.
line of Best Picture, these Best Actress nominees.
Yeah. It actually reminded me, I don't know if you remember this in An Unmarried Woman
Mm.
with Jill Clayburgh,
Yeah, yeah.
where it's her and her friends and they're like talking about Jane Fonda,
Yeah.
who would then later beat Jill Clayburgh at the Oscars.
Hmm.
Anyway, these are the dumb little moments that I live for.
I mean, you and me both. Yeah.
Yes. Well, this from the New York Times again said Miss Garson performs with all the tricks of charm and dignified poise that have endeared her to the vast movie audience.
So, in other words, keep that stiff upper lip.
Yes. It's stiff as
Yeah.
always. Yes. Anyway, any other thoughts on Miss Greer Garson before we move on to our final losing nominee?
No, I think it pretty much covered it.
All
So,
right.
endorse the Mrs. Parkington remake by Todd Haynes, reimagining. So.
Yes. I'm envisioning a truly hellish nightmare, which is a remake of both Mr. Skeffington and Mrs.
Yeah.
Parkington crossover
Yeah.
event extravaganza.
Totally.
Anyway, Hollywood, are you listening?
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to our final losing nominee. I've been waiting all week to talk about this.
Yeah.
Not to spoil my thoughts already, but Barbara Stanwyck in Double Indemnity. This is her third Oscar nomination, and definitely the one that she is most known for at this point in history. Double Indemnity is basically the gold standard of film noir, and Barbara's performance here is probably what a lot of people think of when they think of like a femme fatale type. And this, I will say, is a rare case where Barbara was the first choice to play this role from the start. Even if she was a little apprehensive about playing like a killer type, she still signed on and she certainly made it work. And you can definitely sense why they would want her because it plays to her strengths. But the film, it's all about a guy named Walter Neff, played by Fred McMurray, who is an insurance salesman who goes to a house on a kind of routine call and ends up meeting Phyllis Dietrichson, who Barbara plays here. And she flirts with him and he sort of flirts back. And then she starts to question whether he covers accident insurance, as one does, And it leads to this discussion of potentially killing her husband to get the payout. And Walter ends up falling in love with her and then deciding to be her accomplice. So they carry out the murder, but then some complications arise with the insurance agency, as these things tend to do. So let's talk Barbara. Curious if you have thoughts on Miss Stanwyck here outside of Double Indemnity and what you think of her in this iconic role of hers.
Yes, I mean, so Barbara Stanwyck, I always think about two performances when I think about Barbara Stanwyck. This, obviously, and The Lady Eve from Preston Sturges, which, interestingly enough, was released the same year as her previous Oscar-nominated role in Ball of Fire, which she's also great in. Right. In both of those performances, one comedic, the other dramatic, they showcase what was so striking about Stanwyck's screen persona, which is that there's always a little bit of danger to her. Mm-hmm. And there's a sexiness and an edge that gives her a sort of a modern feeling
yes.
outside of like the anti-Greer Garson in a lot of ways.
Well,
not to just,
now we said it.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I've seen this movie many, many times. And it's one of those things where you almost forget how great it is just because it's such a standard of American cinema. But it really is one of those movies that's as great as people say it is. And a lot of that has to do with Stanwyck's performance. And apparently she didn't want to do this role because she was afraid of how it would affect her screen persona, to which Billy Wilder said to her, "Do you want to be an actress or do you want to be a kitten?" And I think like the fact that she is so like unsympathetic in this part and like has no kind of pretense of trying to soften the character or even to just kind of like burrow beneath the surface and be like, oh, there must be an explanation for why she is this way, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just
Mm-hmm.
there's ice in her blood, and yet you can't help but kind of root for her. Like that's the sort of I feel like you can understand why Fred McMurray would fall for her, and also why even though these warning signals would go off, he would still just kind of like be drawn to her, because she is so dynamic and so sexy and fun and, dangerous.
Yes. Well, I have made my love for Barbara Stanwyck known on this show. The first two times that we talked about her with Stella Dallas and Ball of Fire, I said that she should have won the Oscar. So,
Yeah.
in my own little worldview, she is a 2-time Oscar winner by this point.
Mhm.
I prefer this reality personally.
I do too.
Yeah, this film, like I think it was for many people, was my first introduction to Barbara. Big fan of the film too. We could do a whole episode just about all the craft and the story of everything here. But in focusing on Barbara's performance, I think once again she is showing her range in these very exciting ways. I mean, I love how each of the 3 performances that we've talked about from her are so different from each other.
Mm-hmm.
Like Stella Dallas is such a sympathetic character, and it's a melodrama, and there's so much feeling that she puts into that film. And with Ball of Fire, she's just like fully in command, totally excelling at this screwball energy. And then here, she's playing a far less sympathetic figure. She's playing like a cold-blooded killer, and she pretty much only looks out for herself and is acting in these very selfish ways. And as you're saying, because of her charisma, which is just off the charts here, it's like she still makes it work. She still makes you kind of root for her in a way that is so strange. Shout out to my friend Chelsea, who loves to talk about hot girl shit in classic film. This right here, this is hot girl shit.
Yes.
The ultimate.
Yes.
And she knows that she's hot shit.
She is introduced in this movie like atop a staircase.
Yes.
Wearing a towel. Mm-hmm. Like just from the very beginning, you just like, I mean, for credit to Billy Wilder for all of the directorial decisions that he makes in this film and how he presents her and how he lights her and how he, directs her to do certain line deliveries. Like, I think there's a reason why Wilder's films hold up so well. And that's because there's always this sort of cynical edge to them that works very well in our age of irony. And, I think that most directors of that time would have put most of their sympathies with the Fred McMurray character,
Yeah.
Or like presented him as just being kind of this unwitting accomplice or, like found a way to sort of make him more of the out and out hero. Right. Mm-hmm. But the way that Wilder presents her character, it's like even though like he's narrating the film, she's really the protagonist here, right? Which is an interesting switch because it's like she's very clearly the villain, right? Like,
yeah.
And yet you can't help but just kind of want her to succeed because she's such a fascinating kind of individual.
I also want to talk about the wig, which is a bit much, and I get the complaints about it, but is so indelible to her character that I can't even really picture her without it. But like once again, she's making great use of that husky voice that she has and the confidence in her walk. I mean, honestly, even the way she sits is so striking, and it's all very theatrical, I think, in this very intentional way. And it's another thing with Billy Wilder where he said that her appearance and the way that she carries herself is supposed to feel kind of like a put on in a way. Like it's supposed to feel like it's a little much because it's reflecting how she herself is not to be trusted, that we're meant to see through her. And I think, as shallow as it can be to sort of focus on her physicality, I do think it's a very important aspect of her performance.
You know what it is almost? It's like there's a degree of sociopathy.
Yeah.
Like there's this kind of like, this is how I should behave. This is how like a normal person would behave in this
Yes.
situation.
Seduce a man.
It,
Like she knows all the steps.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Like this is the way that I should wear my hair. This is the way that I should like sit down next to him. This is the way that I should like light my cigarette, kind of thing. Like
Right.
there's a scene that I always think about when I think about this film, and that's when her husband is getting killed. And again, this was
Mm-hmm.
a thing where the production code would not allow for this violent death to be seen on camera. What happens is that Wilder puts the camera on her face, and you hear her husband being strangled. And the look on her face when this happens, she just kind of like allows herself to, it's like she allows the veil to drop a little bit, and like
Mm-hmm.
she looks like she's almost turned on by it, you know
Yeah.
like total sociopath, you know
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
uh and yet again, like it's just, you feel the kind of exuberance that she feels as this is getting done, like the fact that she has been able to convince this essentially, I guess, decent guy, to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Although I'll say, like, I mean, the McMurray character is given a lot more nuance than just being like a good guy who is unwittingly like taken down this path. Like, I think that's sort of another important dynamic of this movie, is that, he is in a lot of ways almost as sick as she is, like he kind of likes the
Yeah.
idea of doing this, you know?
Definitely. She's sort of almost giving him permission to indulge in that side of him that he hasn't indulged in,
Yeah.
sort of thing. Yeah, it's. I also had a lot of notes about that one shot
Yeah.
that you mentioned. It's incredible, and I saw that too. I wrote down that there's like that hint of a satisfaction there,
Mm-hmm.
you know, but also I don't think she like overplays it to the point of making her like, a mustache twirling villain type.
Right. Yeah.
But she also is like not showing a single ounce of sympathy or any regret at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is, it gives me chills.
Yeah. I think like, again, it's just like, it's that kind of thing that like a good director does. They understand how to give a scene something that you're not expecting, and also understands how to like guide an actor to pull that off without telegraphing it too much, right?
Right.
Because obviously it's like it couldn't go too far because it would get called out by the censors. But like that, just that sort of hint on her face, I was like, because I've seen this movie so many times, and that's always the reaction I get from it. So each time I watch it, I'm trying to like study her facial expression to be like, did I imagine that? Like,
Right.
is that really there? And it is there. It's just, it's what a good actor can do. It's just like you can tell what they're thinking without them kind of like resulting to like rubbery facial expressions. Right.
Right. Or narration.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Directly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's one of the clearest examples of Billy Wilder knowing how to direct actors.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many exchanges that the two of them have that are so memorable to me. I literally like copied and pasted an entire dialogue moment where they're sort of going back and forth, and they have this extended metaphor. This is before the murder and everything that's taken place, but he's clearly sort of getting ahead of himself in terms of wanting to see her again.
Mm-hmm.
And she says something about how like there's a speed limit in the state, Mr. Neff, 45 miles an hour. And then he's like, how fast was I going, officer? And she's like, I'd say about 90.
Yeah.
And it just goes on and saying like, suppose you get down off your motorcycle and give me a ticket. Suppose I let you off with a warning this time. And it just goes on
Yeah.
in this great way that is just like, it goes by so fast that you can't even keep up sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But I love how that really just is establishing this kind of bizarre, twisted dynamic that the two of them have, where not only do they seem like a great match for each other, but like they're really thinking on the same wavelength. And he's so charmed by her in a way. And I think for her, she's realizing that they might make a good team,
Mm-hmm.
and the rhythm of that scene is just so fun to watch, especially because, with film noir, there can be a layer of artificial feeling sometimes with the dialogue being very stylized. But I think the two of them are just so good together.
They pull it off. I mean, you read lines like that out loud and you think to yourself, well, this can be kind of silly. But they
Yeah.
pull it off, the two of them. And
Mm-hmm.
it is an interesting kind of thing because it's like you do ask yourself, does she love this guy or is she just using him? And I think like the extent to which she could care about another person, I think it's like she just recognizes a fellow sociopath. um, you know, like
Game respects game.
yeah, it's almost like I was, like on Hannibal, where
There
it's
you go.
like
Yeah.
with Will Graham, he says, "This is just what I've always wanted for us," um,
Right.
like, yeah, I mean, the dialogue in this movie is second to none. Wilder co-wrote wrote the script with Raymond Chandler, who is a
Mm-hmm.
great film noir writer. Wrote the original books of, The Big Sleep and, all those great, The Long Goodbye and all those things. Like that hard edge to the dialogue. The two of them play that so beautifully, and the rhythms of it are just. I find myself sometimes just rewatching certain scenes from this movie,
Mm.
just from the joy of hearing the way that the dialogue is delivered. You know, uh, yeah, there's just a beautiful musicality to it that is
Yes.
invigorating to watch.
And it's also fun to take a shot whenever Fred McMurray says "baby,"
Yeah, you'd be
which is about 100,000 times.
you'd be as drunk as
Um,
his character might have been in this movie. So
yeah. There's also this other thing that I took note of, which is all these meetings that they have at the grocery store,
mm-hmm.
all those little sort of hushed conversations. I love all those scenes. The one I always remember is when she's wearing her sunglasses
Yeah,
inside.
I, w-
Real casual.
I was just about
Um,
to say. I mean, like the hot girl shit, like that is
yes, very much.
iconic image there.
Truly. But it's after we have Lola starting to cozy up to Walter,
Mm-hmm.
Lola being Phyllis's stepdaughter and her husband's daughter, ex-husband, I guess you could say at this point.
Yeah.
Um, but Lola's really sort of cozying up to Walter now, and Phyllis is just sort of, she's seeing right through her, and she's clearly very bothered by this, and it really is setting up what she's intending to do with everything that happens in the third act. But the way she just like manipulates this conversation, because Walter's starting to sort of reconsider their whole plan to get the money, and she's like, no, like once we committed to doing this, we have to follow through, like there's no turning
Mm-hmm.
back. And she says like it's straight down the line for both of us, and she like takes her sunglasses off, and again it's so iconic and so chilling, and a lot of this too could probably be a little cheesy or forced if this is another actress here, but I think she knows the exact right tone.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, Barbara Stanwyck understands the assignment,
Yeah.
and she's just totally locked in. But also not in a way that's like she is like trying to create an iconic character for the audience, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Like she's just literally locked into this story. She's not like playing it up for the audience. That's how I feel.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, what we were talking about earlier with Bette Davis and Mr. Skeffington. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
the potential to really go over the top a lot. And
Right.
I think really it is just like she understands this character, and
Yeah.
like the exact sort of nuances and rhythms that she requires. I mean, like the relationship with her stepdaughter is so fascinating because like there's that scene where she's describing like having seen her practicing in the mirror,
Mm-hmm.
which again like leads me to believe that she's just like a total sociopath. And
Totally.
like
Yep.
and again like she could do all kinds of things to sort of distance herself from that, and let the audience know that she's playing a character, but her total
Mm-hmm.
commitment to it is what makes it work.
Right. And what you're saying there is also reminding me of what we talked about way back when we talked about Bette Davis for Of Human Bondage, which is another character for her where she's so locked into that role and does not care at all if the audience hates her.
Mm-hmm.
And you can imagine other actresses wanting to like soften it a little bit or really like play up the sympathy, but she doesn't do it there, and I don't think Barbara does it here. And maybe in the end this is what cost her the win, but
Yeah.
we'll talk about that later. Well, I mean, I guess since a lot of people have seen this, we can probably talk about this ending pretty safely.
Yeah. It's
If you don't want it spoiled for you, skip to the next section,
yeah.
but please watch this movie if you haven't already.
Yes, please do. Going along with my theory that she's a complete sociopath. God, I forget what the line is. Maybe you wrote this down, but she's just like, I thought I didn't love you until that moment when I pulled the trigger.
Yeah.
Like,
mm-hmm.
It's just because I think there is this kind of like maybe she likes this guy. I could see it.
I feel like it's ambiguous.
Yeah, because and I think it's a credit to her as a performer that you don't really know.
Right. Because we haven't seen her show this kind of emotion before.
Yeah.
Because she's like actually tearing up
mm-hmm.
at a certain point.
Well,
yeah.
And she might be tearing up because she thinks, what am I going to do with this body?
Well, there's that.
But yeah, I mean, I think like there's, again, it's kind of like that, the cop and the serial killer. We're not so different, you and I.
mm-hmm.
There's this quality of like, I think like the extent to which she could care about another human being, she does sort of care about this guy, right? I mean, like,
yeah,
they are. It's about as open and honest with another person as she can be, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So there is
like this is as good as it's gonna get for Phyllis. Let's be real.
God, yeah, this is a great movie.
I love that we never really know for sure if those feelings were genuine.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I find so fascinating about this performance and this character is that, normally it's a bad thing when you feel like you can't really read a character because like maybe they're written in a way that's sort of shallow or the actor's just doing a bad job of communicating that inner life. But everything here from the first scene is so intentional. Very intentional from both her and Billy Wilder. So it's a perfect performance.
Yeah, absolutely perfect. I mean, I don't know, perfect performance in a perfect movie. I mean,
yeah,
there's no real excuse to talk about this aspect of it, but I'll just bring it up anyway. Edward G. Robinson in this movie is fantastic.
Yes.
And like I love the because there is a scene we didn't talk about that he's in. It's the only time that they're on screen together. She comes in
mm-hmm.
to talk to the head of the insurance agency, and she has to like give this performance of feeling indignant that they would even question that because they believe that her husband committed suicide, basically. And like Robinson buys it, and his whole thing is just like, I'm the guy who can sniff out the BS, and eventually like he does start to figure out what's going on because he's the smartest person in the room. But like, I mean, that's another scene that could go wrong in a variety of different ways. Right. But again, it's like, you can see her doing the calculations in her mind of like, okay, how do I react to this in such a way that doesn't raise suspicion while at the same time, like gets me off the hook, Yeah. She's just fantastic in this movie. I don't know what more to say.
Truly. I agree. And the New York Daily News said Barbara Stanwyck has given many interesting portrayals of femininity on the screen, but she has never presented as subtle and indelible a characterization as the one of Phyllis Dietrichson in Double Indemnity.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I mean, I'm just saying in a vacuum, like, this is the kind of review that any actor dreams of.
Yeah.
Like, that kind of a praise. But hard to disagree. It's incredible work that has definitely, surpassed anyone in this lineup, including Ingrid Bergman, in terms of impact, I would say. So this is a performance that will be watched and watched again and again for years to come.
Yeah, I'll say it's a shame she didn't win for this.
No,
because 4 years later, 1948, which is another episode I appeared on, of this podcast.
Yes. Yes.
I bring this up because I was reading Inside Oscar, the chapter on that, and
Mm-hmm.
poor Stanwyck, she was nominated for Best Actress for Sorry, Wrong Number, and she lost again. And she said, well, I mean, they'll have to give it to me next time, right? Yeah. Which
There
is
wouldn't be a next time.
no, and I mean her movie career was basically over after 10 years after that, and she
Yeah.
it's a sad thing because we talk about people like our favorites Glenn Close or Amy Adams
Mm-hmm.
or all these people who haven't won Oscars yet, and we think, oh, it'll happen eventually, but sometimes it doesn't, and
Yep.
it's just a shame it didn't happen for her.
Yeah. She did get an honorary award down the line, but not the same. Well, shall we get to our winner?
Yes, let's do it.
Ingrid Bergman for Gaslight. Very excited to also talk about our winner here, Ingrid Bergman. She earned her first nomination the previous year for not Casablanca, For Whom the Bell Tolls.
Always perplexes me. So
yes, but obviously is coming off of huge year for her career, and Gaslight is adapted from the play, and it was actually bought to be adapted for an Irene Dunne vehicle. I mean, I feel like Irene Dunne keeps getting brought up as almost did certain things and is another person who never won an Oscar. But yeah, so then MGM acquired it and they wanted Hedy Lamarr, but she turned it down. And then here's Ingrid Bergman, and she wanted to do it, but she sort of had to be loaned out. So it was a whole production, but she ends up in the part. And the story, it involves her character Paula. Her aunt was murdered in her home, and Paula eventually grows up and marries a man named Gregory, played by Charles Boyer, who convinces her to live back in that house where her aunt was murdered. And we see over time how Paula is experiencing some psychological trauma where she sees the gas lights flickering and she hears noises upstairs and she seems to be losing things. And Gregory is not helping matters and tells her that she's going crazy and that it's all in her mind. And things just gradually start to unravel for her until she realizes that maybe she's not going crazy after all. So let's talk about it. Ingrid Bergman, any thoughts on her as an actress? And what do you think of her here in her first Oscar-winning performance, first of 3?
I mean, what is there to say about somebody like Ingrid Bergman? She's just one of the most luminous screen presences that's ever lived. Throughout, how many decades was she active? 40, 50 years? I mean, not only one of the most luminous screen presences, but as she shows in this movie and in Casablanca, one of the greatest actresses that ever lived. I saw this movie for the first time when I was in college. It was shown in a class that my late friend and mentor, Peter Bogdanovich, taught. That was about directors who he had interviewed for his, back in the day when he was a journalist. And Cukor was one of the people who he highlighted in that class. And so we watched Gaslight and Holiday, another classic that's been sort of rediscovered. And I think that, Bergman in this movie, first of all, I think it's a really terrific movie and owes a lot to the way that it's directed. It's insane to me that Cukor wasn't nominated for directing for this movie. But there's a lot of moments where Bergman could really go over the top in the way that she's showing this woman's descent into what she believes is madness. But I think that she's, for one thing, she's really aided in the way that this movie is shot and the way that the art direction works, and sort of like making you feel the confinement and the overbearingness of this house that she's in. And so she doesn't have to overplay a lot of it, right? Instead, she does a really good job of just like making you feel real sympathy for this woman as she's struggling with her mental state, and like questioning whether or not she is really seeing these things that are going on in front of her. I think it's a really remarkable performance. And of the three that she won Oscars for, I think it's maybe the best one. Certainly.
I think easily the best
Yeah.
one, personally. But I love this performance. It's actually one of my favorite winning performances that I've talked about so far.
Yeah.
And one of the things I was reading about is that George Cukor thought that it would be interesting to have this composed woman like Ingrid, who has such a screen presence and such that luminous quality, like you said, playing a character who is just constantly being victimized by her husband and is really put through the ringer. And I think that's one of the keys, really, to how this is such a successful performance, because she's so expressive and so luminous as a screen presence that it's quite striking to just have the life sucked out of her over the course of the film.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I think is quite a bit different from the other winners that I've talked about so far is just how physical this performance is. And it's sort of what goes unsaid that is even more powerful than what she says.
Yep. No, that was what was really striking to me as I was rewatching this film was, how much she just sort of communicates through her eyes and through her, these little subtle, body language things,
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, there's all these sorts of moments where she realizes that something is out of place or something is in her purse or, and just like the way that thought comes into her mind and is communicated to her is just, you really feel for her. And I keep saying it's what a great actor does. It's just, they give you a great film actor can give you a lot with a little,
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is just the way that they're directed. And Cukor was one of the very best directors of actresses, but it's just like these subtle little things that she does to communicate the internal struggle that she's going through.
Right. And a lot of those moments where she seems like she's forgetting something and she's questioning it in her own mind, I found to be quite relatable.
Yeah.
Just in the way that she actually shows that feeling of like, oh God, like something's gone wrong, but like she's not telegraphing things too much in the sense of like overreacting to, oh no, what's happened?
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of like, this is strange. Maybe let's file that in the back of our mind.
Yeah.
Like that sort of thing, I think, is the best part of this performance. Those little moments.
Yeah, I would agree.
I think from looking back on this film, because I've seen it a few times now, but when I think of the performance, I sort of think of what she does once she's actually being gaslit.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really from the beginning that she's very locked into the character too, and she already seems quite cautious feeling and kind of shy, and she definitely feels haunted by what's happened to her in the past. And it's, like we have that scene with Dame May Whitty,
Mm-hmm.
who's this kind of busybody older woman who is talking about the murder that happened. And she's like so bothered by this woman, and there's so much on her face that's like, I need to get out of this situation immediately. I do not want to be perceived. And, because you really do think of all this stuff happening later on, which is very showy. But even from the beginning, it's like she's really crafting a real journey here and a real human being with a real history to her.
Yeah, and like the moments too where she's trying to open herself up to another person and to be vulnerable around them and romantic, which makes all of those moments where she's starting to doubt herself and to feel tormented all the more effective. And like really what gets me is like, because it's a film that's based on a play, so there's a lot of very long scenes that play out in it at times.
Yeah.
And she has to go through an emotional journey in a lot of these scenes, where she's kind of like going from being very ecstatic and happy to all of a sudden, like basically begging her husband not to leave her alone because she's afraid of what's going on in her own mind.
Yes.
Like there's a lot that she has to do within a lot of these scenes, and she never feels like she's straining or going for histrionics.
Right, like the scene where he's playing the piano and she's like humming along to the melody or whatever, and seems like she's finally in somewhat of a happy place for once. And then she notices that the picture is not on the wall.
Yeah.
And it's missing. And she just like stops dead in her tracks. And really, it's like from here on out, she's just lost in her own mind. And it's really kind of painful to watch this woman who can, she would be so much happier in another situation and so much more, vivacious and luminous and everything if she wasn't married to this horrible, abusive monster.
Yeah.
And I think what she does is I feel like she just gives this character just enough of that innocent feeling, that pure innocence feeling, and the kind of gracefulness in how she carries herself to where you really feel for her, but also she doesn't dumb her down to the extent of just making her like completely clueless and just like flailing around having no idea what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, again, I think that comes from the way that Q-Core approaches this material, because you can see the sort of version of this movie where she is made to be like really victimized and foolish. And it never does that. I mean, it never forsakes her intelligence as a character.
Yeah. And this is an example of a film that doesn't feel like it hates women.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So there's that. But one of her major highlights, probably for me, the best scene for her in the whole film, actually, is where she's at the party where her husband has just invited her to this social gathering after I don't know how long, how many months it seems like that he's been keeping her locked in this house, sort of under the guise of it being for her own good. And, he manipulates her into thinking that she took his watch when in reality he had already placed it there, in the bag. And they're just sitting there and they're watching this piano performance, and she's just like boiling inside. She's like so embarrassed and so upset to the point of tears, and she's just trying to keep it all in, but it just reaches a certain point where she just can't, and she's just bursts into tears in front of this huge crowd, and she's just being taken out, and it's so horrifying but also so effective in just showing how broken she is at this point. She's like so far gone in a really tragic way.
Yeah, and I think like again, you can see the version of this performance where that moment is really played up, but it's that subtle change that comes over her through her face, just like this sort of pained look that she gets when she's like, "Oh my God, I did it again," like what is wrong with me? I think like those moments are what make this performance so great.
Yep. And then everything we have with this inspector guy played by Joseph Cotton, who's been sort of secretly following her from afar, and he's digging back into what happened all those years ago, and finally he's putting the pieces together that Gregory has been sneaking into the attic and looking for these jewels that he was originally looking for way back when. And even when he's revealing all of this, the truth to Paula, what I love is that there's a part of her that clearly isn't fully buying it yet. Like, just because she's been so convinced by her husband that she's the one who's in the wrong, essentially. And I feel like it can be hard to unlearn that thought process.
That's a very tricky thing to pull off too for an actor. Right. And even like towards the end too, where it's like her, her maid. And I think, again, like I keep talking about the way this movie's directed, like so much of like a good performance from an actor has to do with the way the film is directed, because, you're making choices about how individual scenes are going to play. And, there's still a question in her mind, even after she's been told this information, because then her husband comes back and her maid comes in and is like, oh no, I didn't see that guy. And you're not quite sure, like, is she doing this to protect her, or is she doing this because, this wasn't actually real, or, and so then in her mind, she's like, but wait a minute, like, what's going on here? You know?
Mm-hmm.
It's all very like, it's never done in such a way as to make it like feel cheap, all of that development and all these realizations on her part feel earned.
Yeah, because it puts in the work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then, I mean, I don't want to get too much into specifics with the ending and everything just because we're running long and it could be a whole other topic.
Yeah.
But, if people haven't seen it, I feel like this plays better if you don't know what's going to happen in the end. But we do, to be vague about it, we do see the tables turning and she is in this more confident place by the end. And it's just really, on a basic level, as an audience member, just very satisfying to watch her finally in control of the situation and in control of her life. So yeah, this is another one where it's like, this is a fantastic ending, both as a film and for her performance. So yeah, this is another one for me where I would say this is a perfect performance.
I would say so, yeah.
Yeah. The New York Times said, with Mr. Boyer doing the driving in his best deadpan hypnotic style, while the flames flicker strangely in the gas jets and the mood music bongs with heavy threats, it is no wonder that Miss Bergman goes to pieces in a most distressing way. Both of these popular performers play their roles right to the hilt.
High praise from Mr. Basil Crowther.
And also that probably speaks to just the success of both of their performances, just the interplay they have with each other, which I think Charles Boyer is excellent here too.
I'd say so, yeah. I mean, in a role that could very easily go very wrong,
Oh, yeah. Well, let's transition into talking about this race, shall we?
Yes, let's do it.
All right. Well, from what I was reading from Inside Oscar, I'm sure you've read the same thing. Apparently, David O. Selznick went all out in campaigning for not only Ingrid Bergman, but also Claudette Colbert and Jennifer Jones in supporting. So, I mean, that really helped to boost them. I mean, the chapter itself is very short. I'm not sure why, but I wasn't able to get much about the race outside of them.
Yeah, not a whole lot there. But
although I will just also add another dynamic here. I totally forgot to mention this in the 1943 episode. We now have the Golden Globes.
Oh, yes.
as a precursor at this point.
Yeah.
They were created in 1943, where Jennifer Jones actually won there too. And then this year, the winner was Ingrid Bergman. So look at them. They're already 2 for 2.
That's right. Yeah.
Lining up with the Oscars. There aren't any nominees yet. They just picked the winners at this point. But yeah, she wins that. She's the runner-up at the New York Film Critics. She's also on the list for National Board of Review. And, I mean, like, none of her other competitors had any of that support from the other awards. Although Barbara was also a nominee from the New York Film Critics. But otherwise, it was like, Ingrid, this is your time. We gave you a nomination last year. Here we go. So why do you think that she ends up winning here? Why is this her year?
Well, she had just been in the previous year's Best Picture winner, Casablanca, which was the same year that she got her first nomination for a movie that if you put a gun to anybody's head, I don't think they could have told you existed. But, I mean, at that point, it was like she was that kind of classic rising star, like her basically from the time she came to America with Intermezzo throughout these 4 or 5 years, it was like a Star is Born moment. And she really didn't have any competition as far as I can see. Like you mentioned that she and Barbara Stanwyck were runners-up at New York. The person who won the New York Film Critics Circle Award for Best Actress was Tallulah Bankhead in Lifeboat, who wasn't even nominated. So, and I think from what I can tell, she was really the only person who was widely expected to get nominated who was not. Yeah, I mean, it was just her time. Like, Hollywood wanted to say, welcome. even like Barbara Stanwyck in that Inside Oscar section, she said, I'm a fan. She deserved it. So
Yeah, she literally said, "I don't feel at all bad about the award."
yeah, like
because her favorite actress won.
I mean, there you go.
Yeah, she had support even from her competition. Yeah,
and like you
so
mentioned Selznick. Important to note that she was a contract player, and Bergman was, and she was about to appear in Spellbound for him the very next year. So he said, "Hey, even if like Claudette isn't going to win, this is a win-win for me."
Yeah, I think the Oscars were really in this mode, mostly in Best Actress specifically, of just really being like, "Oh, you are the exciting new star. We like you. Here's your Oscar." And sometimes they make you wait for it, but they'll give you a nomination maybe as a welcome to the club, but then the next year they're like, "Okay, you've proved yourself. Here you go. You're a star of tomorrow," essentially.
And they were right. Like she had
they certainly were in this regard. Yeah.
She had longevity. And I'll say, like, it's great that she won for this and not for, because so often we see this happen all the time. Actresses win at the right time, but for the wrong role. And this is certainly not that. She is, like we've said, she's really good in this movie and, proves that she was a real star. So, would she have gotten my vote? Oh, you'll find out soon enough. But, it's just, I think of, most of the other performers that could have won. She's a good choice.
She's an excellent choice. Definitely. Yes, absolutely. So no complaints with this year's winner. Love when this happens.
Yeah.
Let's move on to Twitter questions. Let's speed through these.
Yes.
Here we go. Let's go to Will, who says, "Why no nominations for Claudette Colbert since 1936? And then he asks like 4 other questions after that, which is, why was this her last nomination? What's your ranking of her 3 nominations? And did she win for the right role?"
Well, I mean, for the answer to that last one, yes, she won for the right role.
Yeah, no doubt about that.
That movie is great. She's great in it. In terms of the ranking, I'd say this, Since You Went Away, is my second, I suppose. Because I have to admit, I have not seen Private Worlds.
Yeah, that's okay. It's not great, but I would rank it third of the 3. So I wouldn't say that it's better than what you're seeing here and Since You Went Away. But I mean, as far as like why no nominations in this 8-year gap, I think it's a pretty good question. She was certainly very popular during this time. She had a lot of great roles. You mentioned the Palm Beach Story, So Proudly We Hail. I'm not sure if like her reputation may have cost her some support, which she was considered very professional and seemed pretty well liked, but she also had like these very specific demands about only being filmed from one side of her face. I mean, I don't know if that has any factor in anything when we have Bette Davis, who was certainly quite demanding in her own right. But yeah, it's hard to say. Sometimes the Academy just isn't really as interested, or the roles aren't quite there for a while. Like, we just have Jessica Chastain finally getting her 3rd nomination after 9 years.
I think,
and it's like, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, there's also just like timing and competition. I'm looking at some of her films here. You could have justified a nomination for her in Midnight, but that was released in 1939 when there was a lot of competition in that category. So, or like you look at the year she won for It Happened One Night, she had 3 movies that year that could have theoretically gotten her a nomination. The other 2 being Imitation of Life and Cleopatra. So if those had been released in other years, you could see where she would have been nominated.
Exactly. Right. And then for why this was her last nomination, I mean, she did make a fair amount of films, mostly through like the mid-50s. I don't know. I think maybe in general, I would say that Claudette Colbert has a certain style to her where she can make things, make it all look too easy, I would say.
Yeah.
Like she's not outwardly showy about her performances.
Yeah, I would also say, just like looking at some of these movies, nothing jumps out to me as a snub. after.
Well, that too.
Yeah.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Not that I've seen them, but I haven't even heard of them.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that should tell you something. Zeta Short said, would you let Fanny Trellis, who's the Bette Davis character, set your entire life on fire?
I mean, no, not like,
She's she's self-centered, and I wouldn't want her anywhere near my life.
I should say so, yeah.
But the other question is, why is Mr. Skeffington so bad and yet so entertaining? I mean, I think we pretty much answered that in our discussion of that. Just everything's at 11, and it's like a train wreck sort of situation.
Yeah. I mean, that's a fair assessment,
Yep. Christoph N. asked us, why is the film called Mr. Skeffington and not, as Bette Davis calls it in her autobiography, Mrs. Skeffington? Thank you.
Yeah, I think
drives me crazy.
You have to ask the people at Warner Brothers. Yes. I think that just kind of the problem with that movie. It shows you where its priorities were, in a sense.
Exactly. Yep. Mark Brinkerhoff said, in the Battle of the Ingtons, which performance comes out on top, Davis or Garson? And which film holds up better?
I mean, I guess Garson by default. I don't know. Like I said, I find Mr. Skeffington to be really fascinating to watch. So, but I don't know.
Yeah. For me, in this one case, I think Greer Garson is better.
Yeah.
And it pains me to say that, but I have the least problems with her performance here.
Mm-hmm.
As far as which film holds up better, I mean, I think Mr. Skeffington has a campiness to it that will certainly appeal to some viewers.
Yeah.
But I guess Mrs. Parkington would be less isolating to more people.
I suppose. Yeah. I mean, if I'm
I don't know,
saying which movie I'd rather watch drunk,
Well, yeah. Skeffington all the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. From Christoph N. This is the fourth and last time Bette Davis and Greer Garson were nominated in the same year. What's your favorite of those four matchups?
Oh, God. Let me just...
Well, I'll go first while you look. This is very, very easy for me.
Yeah.
Definitely 1942, which is Bette Davis in Now Voyager and Greer Garson in Mrs. Miniver, which is the two of them for me at the top of their careers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at these other Greer Garson films, and I'd say that has to be it.
Yeah. Just
because I guess Mrs. Miniver is... I'd rather watch that than Blossoms in the Dust, or...
oh, my God.
Even like Goodbye, Mr. Chips, which I just... I don't understand.
But she's not even really a lead in.
Yeah, so. I mean, like, she's barely in that movie.
Brandon Stanwyck. Did Barbara Stanwyck's wig deserve a Best Supporting Actress nomination?
I mean, there's a lot of other nominations and wins that Double Indemnity deserve, so sure, why not? So.
Absolutely. Kick out Aline McMahon for that awful Yellowface movie and put in Barbara Stanwyck's wig.
Oh my God, yeah, I forgot all about that. Jesus.
Dragon Seed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank God Katharine Hepburn's not nominated here.
Could you imagine?
I would have had to talk about that.
Yeah. You had enough of that with The Good Earth. Yeah, it's your...
Exactly. I can only take one Yellowface performance in Best Actress. Thank you very
Truly,
much.
Yeah.
Let's move on to Fritz. Was Barbara Stanwyck a strong contender, or do we just wish she was from today's point of view? Probably a little bit of both.
Yeah.
I mean, Double Indemnity, I think, is far and away the most watched and most loved film among these nominees, so it's easy to say that, but I'm not going to make any definite statements until we get to the runner-up verdict at the end.
I'll save that as well. So
yes. Eric Maxwell Brunn said, would you give Barbara the win here since Ingrid will win 2 other Oscars later? Well, again, in my worldview, she's not overdue at this point.
Yeah, she's already got a couple of wins from me as well at this point, too. So.
Yes. So, I won't spoil whether I would give her the win, but in general, I don't think that Ingrid Bergman should have won those other 2 Oscars, so I guess I would disagree with the premise.
Yeah, I mean, in my multi in my alternative Oscar spreadsheet that I have, and I'm sure everybody else has, Ingrid Bergman
Yes.
probably has multiple Oscars for me as well, but not for the movies that she necessarily won for.
Correct. This is from Sumuluma. Had Barbara Stanwyck had studio backing, would she have won this year?
I don't think so. I think that this was always, from everything that I've read from Inside Oscar and from reviews, it just seems like this was Bergman's to lose.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I don't think any kind of studio campaigning would have helped
Yeah.
her. I mean, it maybe would have gotten her a few more votes, but I don't think she would have beat Ingrid Bergman. I don't think anyone could.
Yeah.
Mark Brinkerhoff said, Barbara Stanwyck surely was the runner-up this year, yes? We'll see.
We'll see.
We'll talk about it later
Yeah.
on. But then he said, was this the closest she came to winning an elusive, well-deserved Oscar?
I would say that maybe the closest she ever came was her first nomination, if I had to guess.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
I was going to say that the closest she might have come is Ball of Fire.
Well, see, all right, here's my my caveat for that. I think that, and again, I should probably go back and read my Inside Oscar chapter before I make this pronouncement, but I feel that that Joan Fontaine winning for that was a makeup award for her losing for Rebecca, which I think
Yes.
she was more deserving for. So
Yes.
that's why I would say that, because I think that her performance in Stella Dallas was like one of those kind of, oh, here's Barbara Stanwyck type of things.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
But and also I just I don't know the extent to which Louise Rayner was a front runner to win her second consecutive Oscar for The Good Earth, but I'd like to think it was a little tough.
Yeah, especially with that competition.
Yeah.
It's not just her, it's Irene Dunn in The Awful Truth.
Yes.
I mean, anyway, listen to that episode. This is from Fritz. Did you see the Diana Wynyard version of Gaslight, and do you prefer it? I did not see that version.
I have not. It's on my Blu-ray that I have of Gaslight. I was going to try and watch it before this, but I didn't have time, so I will watch it eventually.
I remember Diana Wynyard when we talked about her with Cavalcade, and I do not want to watch another film of hers.
And I will say also, I can already answer this question and tell you that I will always prefer the George Cukor Ingrid Bergman version of that movie.
There you go.
I haven't even seen it yet, and I know that's the answer.
Yeah. Moving on. Miles McHale says, given the somewhat negative retrospective views on her wins in 1956 and 1974, should Ingrid Bergman's streak have stopped here?
I'm not opposed to her winning more Oscars, but I just wish they had been for different movies. So
yeah, exactly what you said. No further comment.
Yeah.
Fun one from Chelsea here. Recast these actresses in their fellow nominees' roles. And she said, I think Stanwyck would crush Gaslight.
Oh,
Maybe.
man. I was about to say, put Stanwyck in Mr. Skeffington. That was my...
Oh, boy. Yeah, sure. I did write down some things here, so I wouldn't be taking too much time.
Okay, you go for it, and let me think about this for a minute.
So I think that would be incredible, Stanwyck and Gaslight.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm gonna challenge myself to come up with my own. I'd say put Ingrid Bergman in Double Indemnity. We've seen with something like Notorious that she can probably do something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's put Barbara Stanwyck in Mr. Skeffington. I think she has the range. And she could probably provide more nuance, I would say, than what Betty does.
Yeah.
Just saying. Here's my challenge. I'm going to say put Greer Garson in Gaslight.
Ooh.
And that would be a really interesting challenge for her, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then Claudette Colbert, I think she would make for a fine Mrs. Parkington. Why not? I think she would also do very well flirting with Agnes Moorehead.
Yes.
Just going to throw that out there. And then I guess this is left over. Why not have Bette Davis doing Since He Went Away, which is, a more warm, maternal role like she showed with Now Voyager in the end of that film. I don't know. I think that would be my combination. I mean, there's probably easy swaps that you could make, like, putting Greer Garson in Since You Went Away, but that feels kind of redundant.
I was going to say, I mean, like, that seems like the most obvious kind of.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to just do this. I'm going to start by giving Greer Garson the role that she never would have been cast in, and that's Double Indemnity.
My goodness.
So let's see her try to pull it off. I mean,
You're like daring her.
Yeah. Just give it a shot, all right?
Yeah.
Let's put let's see here. I'm gonna put Claudette Colbert in Mr. Skeffington.
Ooh.
Again, a little bit of a challenge. Maybe she can tone it down a little bit for that.
I don't think there's a single chance in hell that she's taking that role. Knowing how much she controlled her image, but I would love to see it.
So then let's give Bette Davis Mrs. Parkington.
Okay.
I want to make sure I haven't lost track of this. So, all right. Now I have Ingrid Bergman. I could see her doing Since You Went Away. And a nice little, maybe she's, Swedish born, new to this country, and married an American serviceman.
Yeah, could make that work.
And so then that leaves Barbara Stanwyck that leaves Barbara Stanwyck in Gaslight?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. I was just like writing this down on a Post-it note and trying to remember all
It's like A Beautiful Mind happening right now. Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm sticking with.
I wish we could have done this little switcheroo and just seen what happened with all this, because I just wish that these actresses could actually go outside of their own little typecasting and really show themselves for what skills they actually have.
Yeah.
But anyway, let's move on to the handful of talk about snubs. Fritz and Andrew Carden both want us to talk about Jennifer Jones. Fritz is saying, how did Jennifer Jones get nominated for supporting 1 year after winning lead? And then Andrew wants us to talk about whether Jennifer Jones could have made the cut in lead if she was campaigned here, and who does she knock out?
I mean, I think she totally could have, but I believe that they, and I think they probably did that as, I'm sure that's, Selznick even then understood that, like, you campaign somebody in one category and not the other. Although this was the year when Barry Fitzgerald got nominated in both for the same performance and Going My Way.
Yes.
So it's possible. I mean, I guess she would knock out either Davis or Garson, but
yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, maybe Garson. I don't know. I mean, both of those films are pretty much like 2 nominations and done, so it's hard for me to say which one was more popular than the other. But
I'm gonna be different and say kick out Bette Davis.
Okay.
But I mean, this is like the last of her big run of nominations she had until All About Eve. So I feel like they were maybe starting to wane on her, where with Greer Garson, like, we're still in the middle of this run. She's get another nomination next year, so
they're just like, give us as much as we can get,
Right. Christoph N. said Alfred Hitchcock and John Steinbeck received Oscar nominations for Lifeboat. Tallulah Bankhead did not. How rude is that?
Very rude. I think she should have been nominated, honestly.
Yeah, she's a hoot.
Yeah. I mean, her performance, I think, holds up better than a couple of the others that got nominated.
Yep.
I'd sub her in for Bette Davis.
Totally. Yeah. She's like the life of that film for me. And like I often say with these kinds of things, it would have been nice to say Tallulah Bankhead Academy Award nominee.
Absolutely,
but here we are. KFleet208 said, do you know if the ladies in Meet Me in St. Louis were campaigned in lead or supporting? Could Judy have gotten into lead? Judy Garland.
She should have.
I mean, it's nominated for 4 Oscars, so it was clearly on their radar.
Yeah. I mean, she would have made my ballot that year.
Yeah.
And so would, I'm blanking on the name of who plays her sister in that movie who won a mini Oscar.
Margaret O'Brien.
Yes. she would have
Yes.
made my supporting actress
Definitely
lineup. I don't know. I mean, like, Judy Garland at this point, had she been nominated? I don't believe she had been until.
no.
Yeah. So.
I mean, she won the Juvenile Award, but
yeah, I think at this point she didn't get nominated to A Star Is Born.
right.
So I think that they just didn't really take her seriously as a performer, which.
Right. I mean, she's still very young at this point.
Yeah, that's why she's only 22 years old when this movie came out.
Yeah.
And
I mean, Jennifer Jones is very young too, but I feel like it's just there's something, because Judy was so musical, comedy feeling, and Jennifer Jones is more drama. You know how it goes.
Yeah, I'll say that, like, I've watched Meet Me in St. Louis for the first time a couple of years ago, and I was so mad I had not seen it before that.
Yeah.
Because it could have been a part of my movie watching for years. That movie is great, and she's great in it.
It's wonderful. She really is. I would have loved if she were here. I mean, put in Tallulah Bankhead in place of Bette Davis and Greer Garson, and we've got ourselves a great category.
We do.
Well, time to move on to our final segment.
Let's do it.
This is running long, as these things are wont to do, but that's okay.
Every time you get me on.
No, it's like every episode at this point. I'm sorry to the listeners. I hope there are people who like these longer episodes.
I do.
Okay, good. Well, it's time to decide who we think was the runner-up to Ingrid Bergman. Zach, do you have an answer for me?
I'm going to be kind of different and say that it was Claudette Colbert.
Ooh, she's different.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just strike Bette Davis and Greer Garson out.
Yes.
Like, Garson had just won. Bette Davis already had 2 Oscars. Their movies are not nominated for Best Picture. I think that you can make a case for Barbara Stanwyck just because she had not won at that point. But, like, the Oscar, from what I can tell from studying Oscar history, like, they do not like to reward unsympathetic characters. And I know that they have given Oscars to 2 people who've played the Joker and to Javier Bardem in No Country for Old Men. But I think it's a little bit different when it comes to, like, unsympathetic women,
Yeah.
And
it's a double
like, you
standard.
cannot.
You can say
it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. No more unsympathetic woman in movie history, perhaps, than Barbara Stanwyck in Double Indemnity. But I also would say that I don't think it really mattered who the runner-up was, because Ingrid Bergman was so far and away the front runner.
Question the premise of this show.
It's just all right, it does matter, of course, but
yes, it matters a lot.
Yes, it matters. It like, it's the most important thing in the world.
I think so. Go on.
But I just mean it in the sense of, I don't think anybody was challenging Ingrid Bergman for that Oscar.
Well, you basically stolen my thunder because I was prepared for you to say, oh, it was Barbara Stanwyck because she's great. And she has such a memorable performance. Because I was going to be like, well, actually, it was probably Claudette Colbert. But yes, we're very much on the same page here, which is good. I think it's very easy to just say it was Barbara because of hindsight and how much that performance has really held up. But I feel like, after Jennifer Jones winning for The Song of Bernadette, and especially Greer Garson winning for Mrs. Miniver, I mean, Claudette Colbert has the exact type of character that they responded to in the 40s, which is this sympathetic woman who is going through hardship, but, she's a hero. She's likable. And, I mean, they did support Bette Davis with playing some slightly more villainous characters, but they end up, redeeming themselves somewhat in the end. And I just think that there were some people in the Academy who were threatened by what Barbara does in Double Indemnity. And just like we wouldn't have Rosamund Pike or Carey Mulligan winning later on, I think this would be a performance where people would just be like, but I don't know how I feel about her.
Yeah. And, of the wives in this category, she is, like, the most devoted to her husband. Like, and I think that kind of makes a difference. Now, of course, like Ingrid Bergman, has reason to not be devoted 100% to But yeah, like I think that it is in keeping with, and it is important to say like the kinds of performances that were winning in this category in the last couple of years, like it, Barbara Stanwyck and Double Indemnity would be like a real change of pace for them.
The real left turn.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think if Twitter were around in 1944, I feel like we would have people being like, well, Ingrid Bergman, she's winning all these precursors, but here's how Barbara Stanwyck can still win.
Yeah, it's just... Could you imagine?
Anyway.
Oh my God.
Yes. Well, final question for you, Zach. Mm-hmm. Who would you have voted for from this lineup?
Well, I mean, it would have to be Barbara Stanwyck, just because I've watched Double Indemnity so many times, and I feel like her performance is like so much a part of like what makes that film successful. But I don't begrudge Ingrid Bergman's win over her. I think that's a really good victory.
Very good. Well, I would have voted for Ingrid Bergman.
Ooh.
Personally, I would have been swept up in the Ingrid Bergman hive. Mm-hmm. Just being like, this is a very exciting new actress, and I feel like the amount of depth that she shows, even though I have lauded Barbara Stanwyck so much for this performance, I feel like Ingrid Bergman just provides so much more depth of feeling for me that I would definitely be moved by this performance from her. And I think, in my own worldview, I already have Barbara Stanwyck winning 2 times, so I don't know if I really need to give her a third, even if this is her most iconic performance. So, Ingrid Bergman, here you go. I agree with the Academy.
Sorry. Now, let me ask you this once, since we're on this subject. All right, so
okay.
Ingrid Bergman's other nominations. She wins also for Anastasia and Murder on the Orient Express. Anastasia has these like kinds of, a real backstory to her winning, which I won't get into because it's very long-winded.
Yeah.
But she's also nominated for Whom the Bell Tolls, The Bells of St. Mary the very next year, Joan of Arc, and Autumn Sonata. Are there any performances of that you would give her a win for?
Yes.
Which one?
Well, eventually we'll be getting to those. So I don't know how much I want to spoil.
All right.
I guess in the sense that I don't know how I'm going to feel about these performances on a watch or a rewatch down the line, I 100% would vote for her for Autumn Sonata.
Yes. Yeah. And in my alternative Oscars on my spreadsheet, I've got her winning for Casablanca, same year that she's nominated for Whom the Bell Tolls, and Notorious, for which she wasn't even nominated.
Oh my God. Yes.
That's just what is so... she's sort of like Nicole Kidman for me is today. It's like one of my favorite actresses. So many of her best performances are not nominated. But c'est la vie.
You know what else she's great in? Something like Cactus Flower.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, there's so many greats from her that are not represented in the nominations. Even though she gets like 7 nominations, it still feels like not enough.
And then the movies that she made...
Or that at least they should be subbed out.
The movies that she made with Rossellini, like Stromboli, Journey to Italy.
Right. I mean, that's a whole other...
Yeah.
Right.
Like... Yeah, she's one of our greatest actresses. Like I said, I mean, it's a tough call for me. I guess it's just like I like Double Indemnity better as a movie overall, even though Gaslight is fantastic. And, basically it's like those two I would keep in the Best Picture lineup from this year. Just,
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
The rest of the lineup is bad. Anyway, thank you so much, Zach, for joining me for another long and wonderful episode.
Oh, thank you so much.
It's always a pleasure speaking with you.
It's always a pleasure. I'm glad to be back.
Yes. And of course, you're always welcome back anytime.
Thank you.
Not too soon. I want to invite more people, but down the line.
You have to just sort of, miss me a little bit before I can come back.
Yes, exactly. Where can people find more of you on the internet?
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook at Zach Laws, ZACHLAWS. Yeah, you can just find me on there tweeting about movies and such.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for listening. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin_Jacobson, and the show is at Oscar Runner Up on Twitter. I'm on Instagram at And the Runner Up Is. Rate, review, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you liked what you heard and want to hear more, go to patreon.com/andtherunnerup_is, where you can hear a whole bunch of bonus episodes, including quite a few with our friend Zach here. And next week we'll be talking about the 1945 Best Actress race. The nominees there were Ingrid Bergman for The Bells of St. Mary's, Joan Crawford for Mildred Pierce, Greer Garson for The Valley of Decision, Jennifer Jones for Love Letters, and Jean Tierney for Leave Her to Heaven, with the winner being Joan Crawford. So that's what to watch before next week. And thanks again, Zach.
Thank you for having me. You have some good movies to watch next week. So.
Yes, some of them. And with that, I will bid you all adieu.